Hi everyone, welcome back. In this example this week, we're going to continue to talk about classes. So we'll build another example around creating our own custom objects. And as we do that, we're also going to take that as an opportunity to explore a couple of new concepts. Specifically, we're going to develop a class and then we're going to use it as a building block for creating a more elaborate object, right? So we're going to see how we can leverage other objects within new classes, so that we can really start to think of them as these kind of Lego building blocks that we can create to build complexity into our programs. And along the way, we're also going to look at some interesting little tricks and techniques. So in order to give us something to work with, I thought for this example, we're going to build a class that's going to represent this kind of little cartoon character. And we're going to draw inspiration from these Soot character. If you've ever seen some of the movies from Studio Ghibli, you probably recognize them. There's these kind of cute little black furry soot particles. And we're going to draw inspiration and kind of build something, a character like this in P5. Obviously, they're not going to be as fancy as this, but we're going to draw inspiration from that. So it'll be kind of like a round circle with some spikes around it and two eyes. Okay, and we're going to create a behavior where the eyes are going to be animated. They're going to follow the mouse cursor around. Okay? And again, this is just so we can have a goal to work toward and see how we can develop something like that inside P5. So the first thing we're going to start with is we're going to think about the eye of our character, and we're going to think about representing that as an object. So because our character has two eyes, right, and we're going to give our eyes the behavior that they're going to follow the cursor, it's going to make sense to represent one eye, each eye, right, as its own instance of an eye template or an eye class. So let's go ahead and start building that class. So we saw that in the previous video, the keyword for creating a class is class, and then we're going to give our template a name. Now, in this case, we're going to program this I, so I'm going to call it I, and again, I'm using capital E here because by convention, class names are always capitalized, and this is really so that we can differentiate between variables, right? Variables are just going to be lowercase. These typically are going to be the instance, and in the class, the template, we're going to use uppercase. This way we don't mix them up. So inside the class, right, the first thing we're going to have is this thing called the constructor. So the constructor is a special function that is going to run whenever we create an instance using new of our class, right? So when we say I equals a new I object, right, this is going to run this little constructor. Now, these constructors are not super useful if you don't put in some parameters, right? So what do we want our I object to be? Well, to have as properties, in this simple example, we're just going to put in a coordinate and a size, right? A diameter. So inside the constructor, I want my I, right, to have the following attributes. We're going to say an X and a Y value for its coordinate and maybe a diameter. Okay? So we're going to pass these through as parameters to the constructor. Now I could do like we did in the previous example, we could do the X and the Y just so we don't get the two mixed up. Okay. And we'll say whatever the values come in through the parameters, we're going to grab those and save them on the object's internal variables that we're defining on the left side here. Which means when we create an I, we're going to pass some initial values here. Let's get our first I. We're going to just have it in the center of the window, and then we'll change that down the road. So the constructor, right, is the first thing that happens when we first create the object. It allows us to define attributes for the object and do some initialization. In this case, we're just putting initial values into these variables. And then once we have a class, we can not only create variables inside of it, we can add functions, right? We can give behaviors to our class. So for example, because this I object is something we're going to represent on the screen, let's add some code that's going to draw it, right? And what is that going to mean? Well, we could do, let's draw the outline, right? So we're going to set a black stroke and how do we want to draw the eye? We're going to set a black stroke, a white fill, And then we're going to draw a circle using this dot x, this dot y, and this dot diameter. And again, I keep using the keyword this because I'm inside my class, right? So right now I'm kind of just writing the blueprint. I'm writing the template. So this is not about any specific variable like I. This is about any I object, right? Is going to just follow these particular instructions. So we're going to draw this circle. Now, before we go too far, let's test it out. So I have an I variable here, right? I've created an I object. I put it inside, and then in draw, I can now say I.draw because draw is a function inside my I class. Had a bit of a confusion here. I meant to write fill. Okay, so now I have my circle, right? And let's add the pupil to the eye. Okay, so this is not really the focus of this tutorial, but just to make it interesting, we're gonna do a simple way of kind of putting a pupil inside the eye, just so that it kind of remains into the boundaries, right? So we wanted to track the mouse cursor. There's many ways we could do this, but this is by far the simplest. It's not going to be perfect, but we'll basically get this pupil to kind of move within the box, right? So we're going to use the constrain function to do this. Whenever we draw our eyeball here, we're going to constrain the mouse position to fit within kind of an invisible box here that's centered on our eye, and that uses the diameter of the eye to set the dimension. Okay, so we'll picture an invisible box here, and we're going to use the constrain function to constrain the mouse cursor within that box, or the mouse cursor value within that box. Okay. So let's create a variable. We're going to call it pupil x. Okay? And this one, I'm defining it not using this, just using let here, because we're going to recalculate the x coordinate of the and y coordinate of the pupil just constantly as the mouse cursor is moving. Okay? And we're also going to set a black fill before we draw it. So let's use constrain. We're going to constrain mouse x here, right? And we're going to set the boundaries of this imaginary box here on the x-axis. So we're going to use the center of the pupil as a reference point, and then we're going to subtract a fraction of the diameter. Okay, let's say divided by 4 for the left side, and then we're going to add the diameter divided by 4 for the right side. Okay, so what constrain does is it's going to take a number in this case mouse x, and it's going to keep it between these two values, and anything less or greater than that is just going to get kind of chopped off. So it's different than map. It's just going to ignore anything less or higher than this, and it's going to return either the minimum or the maximum if we go beyond. So you'll see what it does once we draw the pupil. Let's do the same thing for the y coordinate. And of course, we're going to use y here instead of x. And the reason I'm using the diameter, I want to put this diameter here, of course. It's like, why are they different colors? So I have to remember to always use the keyword this when we're referring to our internal variables inside a class. And the reason I'm using the diameter to set the constraint is that if I change the size of the eye, I want this kind of invisible box that the pupil will stay within to kind of scale accordingly, right? I want it to be proportional to the size of my eye, so I'm just referring to that variable to pull this off. And then we'll draw a little circle in here using pupil x, pupil y, and we'll set its size also again as a fraction of the diameter. So maybe this time we'll go divide by 8 so that it will scale accordingly. All right, so this is what constrain does, right? If mouse x comes in, it constrains it to pupil.x minus quarter of the diameter, and it constrains it on the other side as well. Right? So I put in mouse x as the input, and it will give me a value that's kind of bound, that has limits, right? And it does the same on the y-axis. And then as a result, we kind of get this thing where it looks like it's following our cursor a little bit. You know, it's a little clunky because it's a box, it's not a circle, but the math is a little bit easier just for this example. Okay? So we've created this eyeball object here that's following my cursor, right? And we've done this as a class, which means now we have a template for this eye in our program. We can easily now create multiple instances of this template. For example, we could create a left eye, and a right eye, right? And the left eye, I'm going to change this here to left eye. Maybe that is also centered, but we're going to move it to the left by 100. Okay. And then I have to update here to left eye dot draw. Okay, so now it's going to be my left eye. I can also go and create the right eye. So I'm going to use the same template again, just create a new object from that template. And this one, I'm going to move it over to the right by 100. And then once we create the object, we have to use its code. We're going to say right eye dot draw. Now we have two eyes, right? And the second one could be bigger if we wanted to. And because we've programmed it such that it uses the diameter, right? Then the constraint is scaling accordingly and the pupil size, right? So now we have kind of these two eyes that are following my mouse cursor. Okay? All right. So we're going to build on that foundation and kind of develop that, little black fuzzy character based on this. You can imagine, like, if we wanted to write a program that has these Soot characters, what is a Soot character? Well, we could create kind of an approximation of that by drawing a black circle, right? And then having two eyes on top of it. Maybe we'll add the spikes if we're feeling fancy. Okay. So a Soot character, right, might be its own class in our program, right? But it's going to take advantage of this eye class that we've written because our character has two eyes and we've given these eyes a behavior. So it made sense to kind of put that into a class because now we can replicate this behavior very easily, right? If the eyes were just being drawn, then creating a separate class for the eyes might be overkill, like too much detail. We don't need that. We could just draw two eyes. But in this case, we're trying to demonstrate how we can kind of build objects upon other objects by kind of including other classes we've already written. Okay, so what we're going to do for our character is we are going to write a new class, okay, and we're going to call this a Soot. So again, the name of the classes are totally up to us. I'm just making them up, and here this is the name of those characters in the Miyazaki films, so we're going to call it a Soot, and again, uppercase S because we're declaring a template. And we are going to get rid of these variables. These were just kind of for testing. We're going to get rid of them. Okay, so now we're back to nothing, but we do know that we have this I class that we can instantiate, and we're going to turn our attention to the Soot class. Okay, so let's make a Soot variable up here that we're going to use. All right, so what's a Soot? Well, we could say first we're going to put a constructor, right? Just like with the I. And we're going to give this constructor a couple of parameters. And again, because we're writing these fairly simple objects that we're going to use to draw things on screen, having coordinates as parameters always makes sense because this allows you to decide where the object goes when you create it. And then again, our Soot, we're also going to give it a diameter because we might want to, at the end of this program, have Soots of different sizes. So just the two constructors here are more or less the same, okay? But that's because the nature of what we're writing. So the Soot itself is going to have a coordinate and a diameter. And just like with the I, we're going to create internal variables. And then we're going to store these parameters into those variables. Okay. And then we can probably go ahead and add, we know we're going to have a draw command in there. Again, it's worth emphasizing this. I call it draw, right? But it's unrelated to this draw. I could literally use any word here, but I could use the word render, display, right? I'm making these up. I'm coming up with these names, but I'm going to use the word draw because to me it's most intuitive. We're drawing something in this code. And in here, just so we don't get too far ahead of ourselves here, we're going to just draw the body of the Soot, and we're going to draw it as a black circle. Okay, so set a black fill, circle, and turn off the stroke as well. Okay. So this is, again, I usually like to not program too far ahead before, having something happen on the side. So we're going to do this incrementally. So now that we've written a Soot class, we're going to put a soot object inside this variable. I'm going to say soot equals new soot. And our first little dude, we're going to put into the center of the screen, just like with the eyes. Okay? So now that we have a variable, we've put an object in it. In draw, we're also going to use that object's function. We're going to say soot.draw, and in turn, that's going to trigger this little bit here. Okay, so as a starting point, this is going to be our soot, and let's make him a little bigger too, so you have a bit more room to play. Okay, all right. So this is our soot, and you know, why not? Let's get fancy. We're gonna draw the spikes. Okay, let's not be too lazy here. The spikes, I'm gonna use some white lines just to draw a bunch of spikes that are slightly bigger than the diameter. Okay, so let's use. We're gonna push and pop. We're gonna translate to the center, right, of our character. And then we're going to use a for loop to draw all those little spikes for us. Okay, so we're going to say let's have 50 spikes. Okay. And these spikes are going to be lines from the center out to the diameter. Actually, this is now the radius, right? So we're going to take a fraction of the diameter. So this is going to draw a horizontal line. Let's run the code. This line over here, right? And let's rotate it each time by a little bit. So we're gonna have 50 lines. So let's divide. Remember, it's 360 degrees, right? 2 pi by 50. It doesn't have to be very fancy. Okay, 50. Just to make our character look a little bit more interesting. All right. So. Also shows that, you know, we can have more code inside these functions. It doesn't have to necessarily just be repackaging something as simple as circle. Right now, there's a little bit more going on to create this character, so it makes more sense to put it into a function. Okay. So on top of this, what we're also going to do is we're going to add eyes to this character. Now, to add eyes, we've already written an eye class, which means when we create our soot, we'll be able to add some eye objects inside of it, just like any other variables, right? We're going to have a left eye and a right eye, right? So each character will get its own eye object. Now we just have to think about a little bit how we're going to position these and size these, right? So when we create an eye, we need to give it a coordinate and a size. So let's define a variable here. I'm going to call it e size for eye size. Okay, and that's going to be simply a fraction of the diameter. Okay, and the reason I'm putting this into a variable is because we're going to use this fraction over and over in the sizing. I don't want to have to keep writing diameter divided by 4, so I'm just going to write e size. Okay. So the eye here is going to be a new eye. Okay. And we are going to use the x coordinate of our character. So that's this dot x. And we're going to subtract a little bit here. So how much do we subtract? Maybe that's going to be a fraction of the eye size. Go 0.6. Then we're going to put it on the same y-axis, and then we're going to put eye size. We'll do the same for the right eye, except we're going to add the offset to the right. Okay. So now we have 2 eyes, and then once we've drawn the body of our character, we'll be able to say this dot left eye dot draw, right? This dot right eye dot draw, because left eye and right eye are both eye objects, and they have a draw command inside of them. So we can keep doing the dot here. So this dot refers to our internal variable, and then left eye dot draw is going to call the left eye's draw code, and then the right eye's draw code. And now we have 2 eyes. Okay? And because we built the behavior for following the mouse cursor into the eye object, then of course these are still following our mouse cursor. So this is cool because now we've created a template for this character, which means we can create multiple copies, right? We could create a second variable. Let's call it another soot. This one I'm going to put him, I don't know, somewhere else, and he's going to be tinier. Say 100, and then in draw, if we want it to appear, we're going to say another dot draw. Okay. Cool. So now we have two characters, right? Both of them are built using the same template, right? The same Soot class. They just get their own variables, right? When we run the constructor, each of them get their own sets of variables, including two I objects each, which in turn are from this other class we made, the I class, right? So when you think about building your programs, you can start to break things down into functional blocks, into these objects, right? And then your challenge becomes sitting down and figuring out what code do you need to write to represent these objects in your program world, right? And a lot of times we can take direct inspiration from the real world when we're modeling these objects, when we're kind of trying to figure out how are we going to organize our code. Except, of course, our program world is much simpler than the real world, right? We just have a few things to worry about here. Whatever the level of detail is up to us. But what that gives us is kind of really the ability to start structuring our program in a particular way. So we have an I object, and then we use that to build a Soot object, and then our actual program becomes very simple, right? All we're doing is creating two Soots, right? And then we're just drawing them on the screen. Okay, sounds easy, right? Of course, we have to figure out the code that goes into our classes. We still have to program it, but what we're doing here is we're scaffolding complexity. Okay? And this is going to be a way to manage building more elaborate things. And we are going to revisit that concept quite a bit starting next week when we build a more elaborate example of a small game. Okay, and we're going to use all the strategies we've learned so far for that game around functions and objects to kind of help us scaffold things and organize our thinking in the code. So let's do one more thing before we wrap up this example. We are going to create kind of the array version of that program, where instead of just having these two objects, we're also going to demonstrate, right, that these classes, they are infinitely replicable. We can continue there because it's a little factory, right? It's a little factory that can keep producing objects. We can create as many as we want within a program. So we're going to create an array, but just to do a variation on what we did in the previous example, instead of creating an array, we're going to replace these two variables here. I'm going to delete this. We're going to replace this with an array. Okay? Let's call it Soots. Okay? And instead of creating a whole bunch of them in setup, like we did in the previous video this week, we're going to add them as we go. Okay, that's going to be a new idea as well that we haven't talked about so far. So we're going to start with an empty array, and we're going to make it so that every time I click into the window, we're going to create a new Soot object. We're going to give it the same coordinate as the mouse cursor, and then maybe we'll give it a random size. And we're going to just keep building onto that array over time, right? We're going to start with an empty array with nothing in it. And then as we click, we're going to keep adding elements to it. So here's how we would do this. We're going to start with this empty array, right? And then in draw, we're going to put a little bit of code that's going to go through whatever is in the array. We're going to use the same syntax we know. We're going to say for every Soot inside the array Soots. Okay, so this is going to give us a variable that we can use as this iterates through all the elements of the array, which I realize right now is none, but it doesn't matter. And then in there, we're going to say Soot.draw. Okay, so conceptually here is like, this is draw all the Soots. Okay, so this code is going to do this. Of course, if there's nothing in the array, well, this is going to not do much of an iteration at all, right? It's just going to skip this entirely. So what we need to do next is we need to add something to the array every time we click. Okay? And thankfully, because arrays are also objects in JavaScript, there's a function in the array class that we can use to do this very easily. Unfortunately, it is called push. So same name as this one, but it does something totally different. Okay, so I'll just show you what that does. So first, we're going to create a variable. I'm going to call it temp here, just to kind of showcase that this is just going to be a temporary kind of holding place for our object. We're going to say create a new soot and give it the mouse cursor as its position, right? So in other words, take these two values, put them as parameters to the constructor, right? So that's going to become the X and the Y. And the diameter is going to be, let's say, random between 100 and 300. Okay. So just so we have some variety. So that's going to create a new object from our template. It's going to put it into this little variable for now called temp. And then we're going to say soot.push temp. Okay. Or I could have called this, instead of temp, I could have called it a new soot, whatever. So temp, it's just a placeholder. Okay. So we need a place to kind of put the variable, and then we're going to add it to the list. Okay. We could technically do it all in one line, but to me, it's a little bit more confusing. So this push function here, not to be confused with just push by itself. Push by itself, remember, just saves and the origin state of the canvas. Right? In the context of an array has a whole bunch of functions. If we look at JavaScript array class, right? Just as a side parenthesis here, if we Google the JavaScript arrays, we'll see that they have a whole bunch of functions inside of them, right? Once you have an array, there's all kinds of stuff you can do, including push and pop. Now, push adds an element at the end of the array, okay? And as you can imagine, pop is going to remove the last element from the array. So if you want to append things to the end of an array, of a list, you use the array's push command. So same name as this function, but conceptually related, right? But different. They have nothing to do with each other. So push by itself keeps saving the origin, right? And then when you do pop, you kind of walk your way back. Same thing with arrays, except we're going to be adding elements to it. So now this code will start with an empty array up here, right? We do nothing in setup. And then in draw, we say whatever is in the array, go through it one at a time, and then draw each object in turn that we find in there, which in the beginning is none. But then as soon as we press the mouse, we create a new soot object, and we immediately add it to the end of the array. Okay. So now I click, and now my soots array has one variable in it. Okay. If I click again, now it has two variables in it, right? And so forth. So every time I click, my soots array is growing. Now we're just adding more variables to it. Each time, each soot get a different value based on my mouse cursor and a different random size. And of course, I can keep filling the screen with them if I want to. And all of them are all kind of following my mouse cursor because each of them have an eye, right? Two eye variables that have this little behavior we programmed at the beginning of this lesson. All right, so kind of a different way to approach working with arrays, right? Instead of starting with a bunch of values, we're just going to create them as we go. And that's also a useful little trick. So we start with nothing, and then every time I press the mouse, I add a new character with just a random diameter. All right, so we're going to leave it at that for this week. Next week, we're going to have a more in-depth, quite a bit longer tutorial, multi-parts, where we're going to take all of these concepts we've talked about since the beginning, and we're going to build a small game, our little zombie apocalypse project. So I'll see you then. Take care.